Welcome back to Curiosity, Not Judgment. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
So I've got a little bit of a scratchy throat and I'm definitely tired. And this morning at about 2 o'clock, I woke up and my brain would not stop going. So I ultimately got out of bed and started writing. But you caught wind of what I wrote this morning and I was encouraged to see what you had to say, but really was tackling the topic of cognitive dissonance. And I know that we've brought that up in at least one or two episodes over the last couple of weeks, but really that idea of holding these two ideas in tension, and the two ideas may be at odds with one another. And what do you do when those two things are at war in your own brain?
Well, if I was a judgmental person, which I am trying very hard not to be, especially as I record this podcast called Curiosity, Not Judgment, I think it's a judgment to say that two things cannot exist in the same space. Two things cannot be held at the same time. I think remaining curious, I might think, well, is it possible for these two things to be true at the same time? And I think you came up with some really good ones. You did them in the form of yes and, which you and I have a mutual friend who just says yes and all the time and starts every sentence with it. And he's a good role model, actually, because I think that if the whole world said yes and, it would be in a better place. But yes and means, okay, here's something that is you've put out there. I may or may not agree with it, but if I can add to it instead of detracting from it, it might be a better place in which to go from or to. And so I really thought yours this morning were great. You had a few of them. Grateful for a job that pays well and hard work in my community, and understand that the work that I do, you work with people who have endured unimaginable trauma. Both of those things can be true.
Yeah.
I can enjoy a movie, a dinner out, or an item that makes my home beautiful, and must never let comfort cloud my view of those in need. And I can be thankful for the gift of home, family, and love, but should do whatever I can to help others. So, and there's a common theme in here, and that is gratefulness and joy. And it's okay to have gratefulness and joy, even if something terrible is happening on the other side of the world.
Or in your own backyard.
Or in your own backyard or in your own family.
Yes.
And sometimes it doesn't feel right to be able to allow yourself joy or happiness or gratefulness when other people have it much worse.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the old story of is that good or bad, right? And what is one person's trauma is another person's gift, or what is all those things. Can you hold both of those ideas or things in the same place?
Yeah, I think just in a simple visual representation, I think of something like oil and vinegar, right? Those two substances are never going to be homogeneous. They're never going to
fully integrate.
Yeah, fully integrate. They're going to always stay separate, but they are important together and they add flavor as they're together.
Yeah.
And so when we think about things like grief and joy, we think of them like oil and vinegar, that they will never integrate, but they can be taken together in a bizarre and almost uncomprehendable process. Both of those can be true at the same time. And I think when we are in a position of saying it can only be one or the other, we may inevitably rob ourselves of some of the richness of the full emotional experience, and also position ourselves to be postured for exclusively grief or exclusively sorrow or exclusively, poverty, right? If we don't allow the mingling of emotions and thoughts, we may not get to live out the full spectrum of the human experience.
Yeah, and I think that almost goes to also the idea of digital versus analog, right? It can be either black or white, or there can be shades of gray, or it can either be this or that. It can't be somewhere in between. And, while compromise is not always the best solution, sometimes it's better to pick one or the other and go there and see if it feels right or not, or gives you the right outcomes, and then switch to a different track, so to speak. There's often times where, as you say, that oil and vinegar are both aspects of something, almost like the yin yang of something, and you can't really appreciate one without the other. And a little bit of both is a much better solution than just one or the other.
Yeah. What really got me thinking about this at length is just the sheer exposure to bad news. And I'm the kind of person that I am very emotionally wired. I am very empathetic. And if you tell me something terrible is happening in your life, I feel almost compelled to join you in the terrible. I see it almost as a stance of solidarity, a stance of friendship and love. And so it takes a blink of an eye for me to get into a place of gloom and doom when I start having lots of exposure to bad news. And there is a lot of bad news these days, and there's a lot of really unhappy people, and there's a lot of people who are very vocal about their unhappiness. And so if I am not very conscientious about it, I can let myself go down that hole with them in a kind of a twisted appreciation of that person and who they are, and not consider the fact that I can bring the balance perhaps in a one-sided outlook.
Interesting. So now empathy, I was always taught, is being able to kind of walk in another person's shoes and or feel what they do, but it's very different than sympathy, which means you agree with them or you agree with the external factors that are affecting them. And so how do you separate those things? Don't people often think when you're practicing empathy that you also are practicing sympathy?
I'm not wise enough to, really dissect this definition,
Sure.
but I guess in the practical, if you tell me my cat died,
Yeah.
right? I might say as a sympathetic person, oh, Gary, I'm really sorry. That is really hard.
Yeah.
As an empathetic person, I might start to well up in tears. I might to start to feel what you're feeling or attempt to feel what you're feeling and draw myself into your emotional response.
So so you've got your own emotional stuff, and then you're living the people's around you's emotional stuff. That's got to be tiring.
Hence my waking up at 2:00 this morning. It is, it's terrible. And I am working on the process of retraining the way that I am and respond. And I absolutely want to be a person that you would count on to come over and comfort you when your cat has died. But I don't want it to be something that pulls me into grief and I am unable to counter any type of joy.
Sure. I was in the medical field for a while, as you know, and hospice nurses always fascinate me. People who can go and just be with people who are dying. And it's something, man, when I was going through cancer, there was some people who would shy away from me just because I was saying the C word out loud. And yet these people go in. It's almost like the firemen running into the flames, into the tragedy, as opposed to running away from it. And that always fascinated me, and I was always very, very careful to make sure that those folks didn't burn out, because there's not a whole lot of people who raise their hand and say, I want to be a hospice nurse.
Right.
And sometimes I would ask them, so how do you take care of yourself? And there's many answers, as there were people, of course. But one theme, though, was, I don't think it affects me the same way it affects others. In other words, for whatever reason, they can do that and it doesn't have that profound effect, where if you and I went in there and tried to do it, it might.
Yeah.
So I think some people are wired differently.
For sure.
You are wired differently. And so based on that, we know that people aren't wired badly, they're just wired differently. How is it that you then should filter news from things you clearly can't do anything about versus people some of whom you need to care about,
Mm-hmm.
and some of whom maybe you shouldn't.
Yeah. I don't know that there's ever somebody I shouldn't care about, but I think there are certain situations, because of how I am wired and because of my emotional vulnerability, probably situations I shouldn't approach.
Mm-hmm.
So I might say it that way. And I can give you a very practical example that happened last week. We had a display table for the organization, and I was next to the SANE organization. Are you familiar with that acronym?
Mm-hmm.
Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner. You can imagine what that job must be
Oh
like.
my word. Okay, I just realized
So,
what that was. Okay.
SANE nurses have one of the, in my opinion, hardest, most horrific jobs that you could possibly have. And so we were talking as we were sitting at this event. How do you keep yourself healthy? How do you take care of your brain? How do you take care
almost
of your
like a
well-being?
hospice nurse?
Yes. And she, obviously had a different wiring than I,
Yes.
but very quickly said, "Oh, we're great at compartmentalizing." And said it laughingly, but I think that is absolutely true, because there are certain traumas that if you allow yourself to go into an empathetic mode, it just might eat you alive.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So her word for it is compartmentalized, but really it is, she can separate that from her own self.
Yeah.
It can be something that she can deal with and then leave. Whereas some other folks might take that with them. And that would be a tough job if you take it with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But I think, to the original kind of opening of this conversation, can you hold two things at once? Can you be a sexual assault nurse examiner and live a joy-filled life, right? You might think, how could that be possible? The things that you see in your professional realm are so horrific. How could you possibly be a normally functioning human being? And I think it's the beauty of how we're made and designed, that even though it seems impossible, somehow the answer is yes and.
Yes, and thank goodness that can be true. Otherwise, we would not have SANE nurses.
Right.
We would not have people who could go to war. We wouldn't have people who could be trauma nurses or ER doctors, or the many things that seem to some of us, public speaking. I mean, to make it
Less serious.
less serious, because there are some people who are terrified of that. So thank goodness we're all wired differently. And so, I think we've established that you can hold two things at once. Now, how about within the same brain? How do you hold two things at once? Because, we've been talking about certain positions and certain, relationships and empathy and versus sympathy and all of that. But what about two different positions? What about two things like what you've described here? Being grateful for what you have, and yet being trying to help others who are not as fortunate as you.
Yeah. I think compartmentalization is maybe an oversimplification of the process, but if you imagine your house and maybe your dishwasher has overflowed and you've got standing water on the floor, it is a problem and it's going to do damage. Could you go and watch TV and ignore the overflow? Absolutely. You could turn off your brain, you could immerse yourself into a good crime drama or a rom-com and ignore that. But at some point, you're going to have to go clean up the mess. And so those that are exposed to high levels of trauma, and those who are exposed to images, sights, sounds that they cannot erase, are going to have to find a way to properly handle it, whether that be through therapy, through some other practice of really dealing with what's in the brain. Because you can park yourself in front of the TV, but eventually the floor is going to buckle and you're going to be in a worse place than before you went to go sit down for your show.
Right. Okay. But we all said that we're wired differently. So based on that self-awareness, shouldn't I practice some things and not others? Shouldn't I avoid certain things? Shouldn't I, to the extent I can?
Yeah, potentially. If you know that you are somebody that gets really deep really fast with somebody else's pain, you should maybe not be the front-facing person. And I use myself in this example. I am somebody that goes deep fast. I am not the client-facing person. I am the community-facing person. I hear the stories and I hear the impact of the work that we're doing, but I'm not the client-facing person. So I am not hearing about sexual assaults. I'm not hearing about repeated offenses and things that happen to an individual. I have just enough information that I can relay information to the community, but I don't put myself in a position to be on the line of fire, so to speak.
Yeah, so knowing yourself to lead yourself and realizing that you're wired a certain way in a given position, I mean, that's right on. Now, what about other external factors other than your role or your vocation? What about evening news? What about newspapers? What about doom scrolling, they call it now? There's a new one. What about those kinds of inputs?
I think, again, you have to do that internal self-assessment. And we ask the question often, a great curious question for just about any topic is, does this benefit me? Is the news that you're consuming, whether through doom scrolling or being purposeful to go to a particular news site or watching television news, is it serving you? And one might say, of course, information will always serve you, but is that really the case? And even last week or 2 episodes ago, you were talking about the Jordan Rayner principle of letting others curate the news for you. That if something really critical happens, you're going to hear about it, even if you don't do the frontline exposure to the news.
Yeah, and I think, you know, and I love that principle. Now, it doesn't work everywhere.
Sure.
I was just complaining the other day about that Jordan Rayner principle not working on a street that's still torn up, and I'm having to go through it. Nobody called to tell you. Nobody called to tell me that, hey, don't go down Moon right now because. Or Eubank is torn up between Manala and Constitution.
No, but you did call me and I warned you.
You did. But it was after I'd already tried to go through. But the point is that's a really good thing. You're not going to miss anything major by doing that. What about the positive things you can do? Maybe you shouldn't turn on the news, but what can you do positively and proactively?
Yeah. I think looking after opportunities for joy, and that doesn't have to be just self-fulfillment, and it doesn't have to be distraction, but it can absolutely be in service. We have talked many a time about how showing somebody else kindness, how doing something intentional for somebody else is not just beneficial for the other person, but it also does something in you. I don't know what number of podcasts it is. I'd have to go look it up, but we talked about a whole bunch of simple ideas once upon a time about what we could do to kind of kickstart that generosity cycle or the helping others cycle. Something like leaving a roll of quarters in a laundromat, or, you know, being very intentional about just buying a candy bar that you know your colleague likes and just leaving it on their desk, right? You're not doing it for attention. You're not doing it for notice or recognition in any way. You're doing it simply for the joy of making somebody else's day.
But that does take some intention. The other day we were at Costco, which is a place my wife and I probably shouldn't go, but we found this little candle set for the holidays, and it wasn't super expensive, and we thought, you know what, let's buy a few of these. And sure enough, I'm on the way out to pay somebody by check, which I can't believe they still want checks. There's 3 entities in my entire life, 2 people that provide services, and the way I pay my property taxes, because I don't have a escrow account, that I have to do by check. And so I was going to go bring my check, and I thought, oh, you know what? And here's my little pile of candles. I'm going to bring one to this person. So being intentional up front and saying, hey, you know, get some rolls of quarters, get some candles, get some things that you can just then gift and bring to people. But the easiest one, because we all, well, I don't carry around cash as much as I used to, but we all have that spare 5, 10, 20 in our pocket, is to tip people that don't normally get tipped, especially if they provide great service. You know, dropping off my car the other day to a rental person, and this person was just full of joy. And you could tell they were just making everybody happy that dropped off a car that day, even if they were running a little bit late, even if they couldn't have time to fill up their tank, whatever. He was just, I mean, and just, you know, giving that person a tip and saying, thank you for your smile today. You know, those kinds of things are easy to do. And you know what? It's hard to be anxious, upset, worried about the world, angry when you're being generous, when you're being grateful, when you're thinking of others. And I think that's part of the key to it. So at the end of all this, yes, we can hold two things at once that seem to be completely opposite, like oil and vinegar, and how nice it is to dip our bread in that, right? And how useful it is to have those things. And if you find yourself leaning towards one or the other too much, how do we establish our own equilibrium? Knowing how we're wired and knowing what we need to do to continue to be useful to others.
Absolutely. So I think the curious questions around this one are really specific around a particular set of circumstances or a specific set of emotions. If you find yourself getting angry, what is the counterbalance to that? What is your yes and? Yes, you're angry. And what are you going to do to balance yourself out? Is it taking a walk? Is it getting fresh air? Is it calling your mother? Is it, getting on a crossword puzzle and just de-escalating for a little bit? There can absolutely be a yes and. To your point about the intentionality, is sometimes you have to have things queued up, because when you are deep in the emotion, sometimes you're not thinking of that balance. I very recently helped somebody compile a list for when anxiety takes over. When anxiety takes over, you're not in your rational mind to have a balance. And so the list needed to be prepared ahead of time. And it was sensory interrupter things. It was take a cold shower, get a bag of frozen peas and stick it in your armpit. It is do 20 jumping jacks.
Cold?
No, but it's something, it's a sensory interrupter, because when anxiety takes over, you need something to counterbalance the thought life running wild. And so
that's really good. I love the principle of being proactive when you're not in the situation, for when the situation, which is going to occur, occurs.
Yeah. So I love the giant expression, know yourself to lead yourself. And if you know yourself to be hot-tempered, if you know yourself to be one who's deeply emotive and starts crying over everything, pointing at myself, what are some of those preemptive strikes that you can be intentional about to bring yourself balance?
Yeah, and we've hit on boundaries a little bit in the past, but are there boundaries that we need to set up for ourselves and for others? Right? And that we try, and we're not going to be perfect, but we try not to violate for those reasons. And so some of those can be intentional boundaries that we set up for ourselves, but sometimes communicating those boundaries to others is also useful.
And, time limits might also be appropriate in this as well, like a time boundary. Like, I am going to sit with you in this grief and this sorrow all day long, but I cannot do it tomorrow. Right? And so I think just giving some thought to your capacity, how far you can go in terms of sacrifice. I want to encourage the world to be self-sacrificial, but there comes a point in time which you are no longer a help, because you are falling into the hole so deeply that then two of you need rescue, right?
Yeah, two of you need rescue. Although I told you the story that I heard the other day about the guy who climbed down in the hole with him and said, because I've been here before and I can help you out.
Yeah, if you can help somebody else.
If you can help somebody out.
Exactly.
Right, but don't be the person who doesn't swim very well, who just jumps in after the drowning person, not knowing how to save them.
Exactly.
Because then you're going to make two people in trouble versus one.
Yeah.
But now, having those good intentions means that you proactively, if someone's going to fall in the water around you, you have life-saving capabilities and things that you can throw to them, and other things.
Start taking swimming lessons now.
And start taking swimming lessons for sure.
Yeah. Well, I love it, and I hope this is a prompt for you all to start thinking about kind of your own inclinations, places that you find yourself maybe repeatedly, and what is your yes and? How do you start developing a balance? How do you bring the oil into the vinegar, or whatever metaphor that you want to use? That is making me quite hungry, and I totally want some good bread right now, but I think we'll close it up with that. I think some good things to be thinking about.
It absolutely is, and this cognitive dissonance of which you speak, I feel like my whole life is lived in that, and it's okay as long as that is a healthy tension.
Right. As always, we welcome your comments and your feedback. curiosity.notjudgment.com. You can leave comments on Spotify. You can also leave them on the YouTube channel, and we will catch up with you next week.
Take care.